Good afternoon and welcome to The Appeal Live, a co-production of Now This and The Appeal. I'm Alana Sivan, and today we're going to be talking about a new push in Alabama to rethink driver's licenses and the suspension of driver's licenses, which supporters say will keep poverty and low-level offenses from completely upending people's lives. So in Alabama, like many other states, drivers can have their licenses suspended for things that don't have to do with their driving, for minor offenses that have nothing to do with driving, such as drug charges, child support issues, or failure to pay certain court fines and fees. And once your driver's license is suspended, you need to pay a reinstatement fee, which can lead to some really difficult choices. In fact, a 2018 report by the Alabama Appleseed Center for Law and Justice found that 89% of people with suspended licenses reported being forced to choose between basic needs and paying what they owed. And this makes sense because driving is necessary in Alabama, where public transportation is limited. You need to drive to be able to access basic necessities, to be able to work, to be able to access childcare. And the thing is, that once your license is suspended, it is really difficult for a lot of people to be able to pay the fine to get it back. So think of it this way. To make money in order to pay off the reinstatement fee, you have to work. And in order to work, particularly in Alabama, you have to be able to drive to work. So you have to make this really difficult choice of, are you going to risk driving, getting pulled over for your suspended license, and then end up being incarcerated? And by the way, if you are Black or brown, the likelihood of you getting pulled over is much higher. And so you take that gamble so that you can be able to pay off the fee for your license and be able to provide for yourself or your family. You get pulled over, you get arrested, and you're put in jail. Which can lead to so many other negative effects, including the loss of services for you or your children, separation from family, loss of work, not to mention the potential trauma, that you will likely face while in jail. And so just like that, a minor offense or unpaid fee can turn into a devastating cycle that really only serves to perpetuate and punish poverty. But a new bill in Alabama, HB 129, would seek to disrupt that cycle by preventing the state from suspending driver's licenses for unpaid fines and court costs, for failure to appear at a court hearing, certain drug offenses, and some child support cases. Suspension for some other crimes, including driving under the influence, however, would still be permitted. So joining me now to talk about this new legislation and to talk about how driver license suspensions fit into a broader criminalization of poverty. I'm so pleased today to welcome Leah Nelson, Research Director of Alabama Appleseed. Thank you so much for being here today, and it's really a pleasure to have you.
Thanks so much for having me, Alana.
So before we get into the specifics of HB 129, I want to take a step back and talk about how the system currently operates. So talk to us about how these suspensions and other forms of traffic enforcement effectively serve to make poverty a crime in Alabama.
Yeah, it's a problem in a lot of states, and Alabama, as you said in your intro, is rural and poor, which means that it's even more of a problem here. So what can happen right now is, say I'm driving down the road and my car tag is obstructed, or I have a busted headlight, or maybe both. An officer can stop me and issue a ticket for those things. Now, I would pay the ticket right away. I have access to enough money to do that, but a lot of people don't. So what commonly happens for people who can't pay the entire cost of their ticket immediately is they get put on a payment plan, usually $25 or $50 a month. And as long as they keep current on that payment plan, they're okay. Their license doesn't get suspended. But it's fairly common for people to miss a payment. And once you miss a payment, your license can be suspended automatically. You may not even get a letter in the mail. They'll send one, but if the address is wrong or if for any reason you don't receive it, you won't even know your license is suspended. And let's say you don't have time to get your headlight fixed. You're pulled over again for the same reason, And now you get another ticket, this time for driving on a suspended license as well. So that starts this debt spiral, and people can accumulate thousands and thousands of dollars of debt over time. It's pretty common for people to be on payment plans in multiple counties. Alabama is a big state, and if you live in a rural county and you work in Birmingham, you might drive through 2 or 3 jurisdictions on your way to work. You may have payment plans in all of those places. And if you miss even one payment on one plan, your license is suspended. If you miss a court date, I should say you're expected to come to court every couple of months typically to explain why you haven't paid off all of what you owe. If you miss one of those dates because of a childcare issue, because it conflicted with work, or maybe at some point in the past you came to court with as much money as you could muster and they said, thanks, this isn't enough, go to jail. Maybe you didn't go to court because you were scared. That failure to appear is another reason to suspend your license. And people just get trapped in this cycle where they cannot get their driver's license back. They have to keep driving in order to live their lives, get to work, go to the doctor, take their kids to school. I mean, otherwise live life in Alabama. You can't even open a bank account or get an apartment without a driver's license. It's hard to vote. It's one of the most commonly trusted forms of ID, and people need them, and they drive anyway without them. And it just traps people in this cycle of poverty, making it really hard to get a job or keep a job.
You know, and it also seems that once your license is suspended, it makes it that much harder to be able to get your license unsuspended.
Yes, I mean, if you owe money, you need to earn money to pay it back, right? So a lot of people who lose their licenses lose their jobs. I have spoken with people who got a job that had nothing to do with driving. For instance, a woman I met in Montgomery who got a job packing boxes for a moving company. She was so excited. She was a single mother. She has 3 children. She finally had a steady job that paid reasonably well. After they hired her, they ran a background check, and they saw that she had all of these tickets for driving on a suspended license, and they took the job away from her. This woman wasn't driving a moving truck. She was wrapping people's china and books and putting them in boxes. She wanted to earn a living, but she wasn't able to because she had lost her license. We've met plumbers who couldn't get to their jobs because they didn't have a license. It is so common for people to find that losing their license means they lose their livelihood. That means they can't pay their tickets, among other things. So they're really in a trap.
So the stories that you've just told us, I'm sure you've heard, you probably have a dozen more that you could share. And particularly since you've done so much research on the issue. So can you talk to us a little bit about what the data shows about sort of who's the most hurt by this, and what is that, and sort of what the data shows that the harm looks like?
Yeah, people of color are more likely to be harmed by this than others. So we don't have data by race about traffic stops in Alabama specifically, but everywhere in the country where data is collected on traffic stops and race, we know that people of color are more likely to be stopped. We also know that Alabama, like the rest of the country, has an enormous racial wealth gap, which means that people of color are less likely to have the resources to be able to pay off their tickets right away, which starts them on that payment plan road that I talked about before. And what happens is that people start having to make desperate choices. Most commonly, they give up some kind of basic necessity. They don't pay rent, they don't pay for utilities, they don't pay for prescription drugs, so they can service their debt to the state. A lot of them take out payday loans, which in Alabama carry an annual percentage rate of 456%. So people are taking out these astronomically expensive small loans, again, to pay their debt to the state. Now, why are people making these desperate choices? Because they're afraid of going to jail. It is very common for people to be jailed for non-payment, or rather, more often they're jailed for failure to appear at a court hearing. Now, you're expected to show up in court every couple of months. It is easy to miss one of those court dates. If you have a childcare issue, if you work in a retail job and your boss says if you miss another day of work, you're going to get fired, people may take the risk, go to work and miss court. 64% of the people I surveyed in 2018 who had lost their licenses were jailed in connection with that unpaid traffic debt, usually because of failure to appear. A lot of people go to request charity. So this is draining resources from charity organizations, philanthropic organizations that are seeking to help families. And I've talked with people who run these organizations and are frustrated by paying off people's fines and fees for these recurring tickets that folks are getting because they can't get their licenses back, not because they're dangerous drivers. And it's really important to make that distinction, right? Poor people are not more dangerous drivers. They just are more likely to drive on a suspended license because they can't afford to get their license back. And that's what we're trying to stop in Alabama. And just again, going to which community this harms the most. When I did my research in 2018 on fines and fees in Alabama, most of the people I surveyed owed fines and fees themselves, but a small subset of them had only paid fines and fees for other people in an ongoing way. Usually that was their children, partners, brothers and sisters. And so the first group of people, the people who owed fines and fees for themselves, they were about 50% Black and 50% white, which is already an overrepresentation of Black people, given that Alabama's population is only 27% Black. But then when I looked at the subset of people who were only paying fines and fees for others, that population was overwhelmingly middle-aged Black women. So that's where intergenerational Black wealth is going in Alabama. Instead of being able to pay off their mortgages or buy their children a car or help their kids with a mortgage or take a vacation or save for retirement, middle-aged Black women are disproportionately burdened with paying off fines and fees. And a lot of those fines and fees are for tickets for things like driving on a suspended license. It's a really vicious cycle that is draining wealth from our communities of color here.
Yeah, I'm listening to everything that you've just said, and how do people justify this system? I know there are opponents to the legislation, which we'll talk about in a little bit, but like, how on earth do people think that it makes sense to fill jails with people who are just trying to get by, literally get by from point A to point B in their car?
Yeah, I mean, increasingly people don't think it makes sense. The coalition that supports HB 129 includes everyone from Mercedes-Benz, which is one of our largest employers in Alabama and wants people to be able to get to work and live stable, prosperous lives, to Americans for Tax Reform, a conservative good government group that wants people, again, to be able to save money and participate in the economy, to more, human rights oriented groups like Alabama Appleseed, which wants people to be able to live with dignity. I think there is a growing recognition that this doesn't make sense, criminalizing poverty and keeping people so poor that they can't save money and live and participate in all of the things that we say we want people to be able to participate in doesn't make sense. I mean, there is this thing in conservative circles about people pulling themselves up by their bootstraps. Well, in 2021, a driver's license is your bootstrap. Why are we taking that away from people? The argument for keeping things the way they are is really based on the fact that Alabama, like, again, many states, but especially low tax states, we fund ourselves off of fines and fees. So instead of taxes, we have fines and fees. And there is a fear that if we stop punishing people by taking their licenses away, they will no longer pay. That's actually not borne out by reality. Where we do have data from places that have made the kind of change that HB 129 would implement, some places have actually seen an uptick in revenue because people are earning money and able to pay. And other places have seen that it's fairly revenue neutral to stop suspending licenses for reasons unrelated to dangerous driving. Then there are the reinstatement fees. So the last step before you get your license back, after you've gotten current on your payment plan or paid off all of your debt, is to pay the Alabama Law Enforcement Agency, which is like our Department of Motor Vehicles. You pay them between $125 and $400 to get your license back, depending on the reason it was suspended. And if they can't suspend licenses, then they're not going to collect all of those reinstatement fees. They will lose some money. But an economist tells us that Alabama will see $61.5 million in increased consumer spending if we stop suspending people's licenses. The state as a whole will be more prosperous. And if makers see fit to reallocate some of that money to fill the small gap in revenue to the Department of Motor Vehicles or the Alabama Law Enforcement Agency, that's fine. But we shouldn't be holding the whole state back just to make sure that reinstatement revenue remains stable.
Right. So let's talk about exactly what this legislation does. So walk us through HB 129 and also talk to us about sort of where it is in the process towards passage right now.
Sure. So HB 129 would end driver's license suspensions for 3 of the 4 major non-driving related reasons they can be suspended in Alabama. So I'll back up. The 4 reasons your license can be suspended that have nothing to do with dangerous driving are these. First, failure to pay a ticket. Getting behind on a payment plan or otherwise missing payments can cause your license to be automatically suspended. Second, failure to appear at a court hearing about why you're not paying. Third, simple drug possession. So way back in like 1991, 92, the federal government was very ensconced in the war on drugs. It incentivized states to find a way to suspend people's licenses for simple drug possession. That can be something like your friend gave you a Vicodin because you were having serious back pain and she had a Vicodin. That's a felony in Alabama. So if they find you with a Vicodin that you are not prescribed, you get a felony on your record and your license is suspended for 6 months. So you can't check in with your probation officer because you can't drive to the probation office. That's a huge mess. And nearly all states have withdrawn without any penalty from that federal provision. I believe Alabama is one of 4 states that's still part of that federal scheme. The last reason, and the one that's most tricky to deal with, is child support payments. The federal government, again, incentivizes states to have a mechanism to suspend people's driver's licenses if they don't pay child support. They actually tie funding for child protective services to having a mechanism to suspend your license if you don't pay child support. And unfortunately, we found there's not really an easy way to untangle from that. I believe every single state has some mechanism where your license can be suspended if you don't pay your child support, and federal lawmakers are going to need to examine and see whether that makes any sense at all. So HB 129 does not address child support, but would end driver's license suspensions for failure to pay tickets, failure to appear at hearings about tickets, and simple possession of drugs. As I said, we have a coalition that I am so proud of that includes domestic violence advocates who say that they see that their clients are unable to escape dangerous situations because they lack driver's licenses. Women who can't achieve financial independence from abusive partners because, domestic violence often involves control of money. And so if you are trying to establish independence, you may want to open a bank account, but you can't do that without a driver's license. So you can't get out of a dangerous home without one. So we have domestic violence advocates on our side. We have business on our side. We have human rights groups on our side. And we even have some law enforcement in the form of police officers who don't like using their time chasing small amounts of money and would rather be doing other things to keep communities safe. It's been a very busy legislative session in Alabama, as it has everywhere, recovering from COVID. So we've had a couple of hearings in committee. We're running out of time this year. So to be honest, I am less optimistic than I was 2 weeks ago that it's going to get out and actually pass this year. But I am highly optimistic that our coalition is going to come in strong in 2022 and get this up and running again. There's a lot of support for this reform. It is sensible, it is broadly supported, and it's just the right thing to do for so many reasons.
Mm-hmm. Now, all things considered, do you think this bill goes far enough? Because we've seen, and just as you've talked about, there's so much harm that comes with traffic enforcement and so much harm that comes along with traffic enforcement. And I know other states and jurisdictions are even having conversations about getting the police out of traffic enforcement altogether. Just as you said, police officers don't want to be doing this anyways. And we've seen how much harm they can cause when they do. And so do you think that there needs to be more done on this front?
I think HB 129 is excellent as it is, but it's not the only reform that we need to talk about when we think about what we want public safety to look like and what we want police to do. So I think that there are a lot of conversations happening in Alabama, and there need to be more about what we would like police to be doing and what alternatives might make sense. But that's not all going to happen with a single piece of legislation. I mean, we also, fines and fees reform is an enormous animal. We should not be funding our state with the hidden tax of fines and fees. But the very least we can do is stop suspending people's driver's licenses because they're poor.
Are there any other pieces of legislation up for consideration having to do with fines or fees or traffic enforcement generally?
This session, this is the main one. As I said, COVID really threw a wrench in everybody's ability to kind of think strategically about legislation. A lot of our work this year has been sort of bogged down in reacting to the ongoing pandemic.
Mm-hmm. Absolutely. Well, thank you so much for joining us here on the Appeal Live today and for all of your work in working with what it sounds like is an amazing coalition pushing for some great reform.
Thanks for having me.
Well, there you have it. We are looking forward to following how this piece of legislation moves and hopefully, even if it's eventually passes in the legislature in Alabama. And I think it's really important to note how this legislation can potentially be a step in undoing the years of preventing people from being able to live their lives and being able to provide for themselves and their family. I mean, we've heard Leah talk about how the suspension of driver's licenses, at its worst, you're in jail because of it, which is an absolutely terrible result of having a license suspended. But there are all these other small ways, not small, but really significant ways actually, that the suspension of a driver's license can ruin someone's life. The ability to open a bank account, the ability to hold any sort of job, even if it has nothing to do with driving at all, the ability to have a clean slate on your record. All of these things are prevented by a law that pretty much everyone on all sides of the aisle, it seems, agrees doesn't make sense. And what I thought was particularly interesting to note as well, that for the few who aren't on board with this law, which it doesn't seem like it's many, have pointed to the inability of the state to be able to gain revenue, essentially, which is really an important thing to think about, because we're talking about gaining revenue from the most marginalized people in the state, from working class people, from Black and brown communities who have suffered from having wealth taken away from them for centuries and since the inception of this country. And so when we think about the need to stop certain crimes from completely unraveling people's lives, I think we need to consider that history and the need for governments to provide for the people living in their states, not the other way around. So that's all the time we have for today on the Appeal Live. You can continue to follow us and watch us on Facebook and Twitter for the latest news. We'll see you next time.